The bioorganic seat beneath Bren Holloway pulsed with a slow, rhythmic respiration. Attempting to mold itself to a skeletal structure, it fundamentally did not understand. Engineered for the flexible, cartilaginous spines of the Kezan or the semi-fluid anatomy of the Veltra. The chair only managed to press a persistent, dull ache into Bren's rigid human lumbar vertebrae. He shifted his weight, pressing his shoulders against the membrane, fighting the heavy urge to sleep. The ambient lighting of the Helix Array Orbital Academy was a cool, sterile violet, calibrated to soothe the multifaceted optic nerves of the galaxy's elite. But to Bren, it just felt like the bruising sky before a thunderstorm. He sat in the back row of adaptive systems failure theory. He was the only human in the room. In fact, he was the only human in the entire Advanced Orbital Sciences department. The Helix Array did not accept the average. It was a crucible for the brightest minds from the most established civilizations in the Orion Spur. The students around him belonged to species renowned for their ability to calculate orbital mechanics in their sleep, to predict socio-economic collapses centuries in advance, and to seamlessly merge their consciousness with deep space artificial intelligence networks. They were polite to him, naturally. Highly evolved societies prided themselves on their absolute courtesy. But beneath the pristine manners and the synchronized nods in the corridors, Bren knew exactly how they saw him. He was a curiosity, a biological anomaly, an exchange student from a harsh, unrefined frontier world, admitted perhaps as a diplomatic courtesy or a living specimen from a civilization that was still struggling to master basic atmospheric scrubbers. To his left, a Kezan named Orelk was already interfaced with the academic mainframe. Orelk did not use a screen. His secondary eyelids were closed, twitching rapidly as data streamed directly into his neural cortex at speeds that would fry a human brain in a matter of seconds. To his right, Thyre, a Veltra who existed in a state of continuous, localized anti-gravity, manipulated floating strands of four-dimensional holographic code with mere gestures. In stark contrast, Bren reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a tactile drawing tablet and a heavy, carbon fiber stylus. When he set it on the desk, the soft thud drew a fleeting, sympathetic glance from Thyre. To them, watching Bren take notes was like watching a primitive hominid strike two rocks together to spark a fire. It was quaint, tragic, and severely inefficient. The low hum of the room's ventilation system dropped an octave. The heavy blast doors at the front of the amphitheater slid apart with a hiss, and Professor Seraphine Quor entered. The room instantly fell into a heavy, absolute silence. Professor Quor was not biological in any sense that humans understood. She was a living, crystalline entity, a towering structure of sentient silicon and refracted light. Her reputation within the Academy was borderline mythical. She was known for designing architectural and systemic failure exercises that possessed no elegant solutions, only brutal, mathematical compromises. She glided to the center of the instructional dais, the internal light within her chest cavity shifting from a calm blue to a sharp, analytical gold. Her voice did not come from a mouth, but resonated as a harmonic frequency that the room's translation matrix converted into crisp, unyielding English in Bren's earpiece. "Good cycle, students," Professor Quor chimed, the sound like glass wind chimes caught in a hurricane. "Today, we will not be delving into the theoretical. We will begin with what I consider a very easy warm-up exercise." A ripple of nervous energy swept through the highly advanced students. When a legendary architect of systemic suffering called something an easy warm-up, it usually meant half the class would fail by the end of the hour. The grand holographic projector dominating the front wall flared to life. The prompt translated automatically into the native syntax of every species in the room. Bren read the blocky English text projected directly into his field of vision. The parameters were laid out with chilling simplicity. The assignment was to design an emergency evacuation and survival infrastructure for a frontier colony outpost. The inciting incident was a massive stellar magnetic storm. The conditions were absolute. Upon the storm's impact, the colony suffered a total, catastrophic failure of all advanced networks. The outpost lost 100% of its atmospheric sensor grids. The navigational artificial intelligence was entirely purged. All orbital positioning satellites were rendered dark. The quantum communication relay was permanently severed. They were to design a system that would keep the population alive for the first 72 hours following the collapse. Then came the constraints. They were the kind of rules that made highly evolved, system-dependent species physically ill. Constraint 1. No centralized artificial intelligence could be used to govern the evacuation. Constraint 2. No adaptive machine learning algorithms were permitted to calculate routes. Constraint 3. You could not factor in an assumption that rescue fleets would arrive exactly on schedule. Constraint 4. Every single command protocol had to remain fully operational, even if the designated outpost commander was severely injured, incapacitated, or dead. A collective, palpable wave of distress washed over the amphitheater. For species that had spent the last 10,000 years integrating their very biology into infallible, centralized digital networks, Professor Quor's prompt was not a puzzle. It was a horror story. It was the equivalent of asking them to breathe without lungs. How do you guide a population without a central mind telling them where to step? How do you coordinate medical triage if the algorithmic probability matrix is offline? Immediately, the classroom erupted into a silent storm of digital panic. O'Rourke's neural link flared a bright, alarming crimson as he desperately booted up quantum simulations, trying to force a predictive model to account for the chaotic behavior of a terrified, disconnected crowd. Thyre began weaving incredibly complex, multi-layered topographical maps in the air, frantically trying to write a localized, decentralized code that could mimic a central brain without violating the constraints. They were throwing their immense intellects at the problem, trying to build a perfect, fail-safe mathematical bridge over an abyss of absolute chaos. Bren sat completely still. He looked at the prompt. He read the words, 72 hours, total failure, and injured commander. He did not boot up a quantum simulator. He did not attempt to calculate the statistical probability of a crowd stampeding in the dark. He just narrowed his eyes. He pulled his drawing tablet a little closer. He tapped his archaic stylus against his chin. To him, this did not look like a theoretical exercise in advanced structural failure. It looked like a standard Tuesday during hurricane season back home. He closed his eyes, tuning out the frantic, high-speed computations of the alien geniuses around him. He did not see layered holographic maps or probability matrices. Instead, he smelled the sharp, metallic tang of ozone right before the power grid collapsed in his hometown. He saw the suffocating, pitch-black darkness that swallowed the neighborhood when the storm broke the transmission towers. He felt the heavy, humid air of the school gymnasium during the mandatory wildfire evacuation drills. The way the teachers held up brightly colored plastic cards to signal which exits were clear of smoke. He heard the terrifying, deep earth roar of a flash flood tearing down the canyon, washing away roads and completely isolating his community from the outside world for weeks. Most vividly, he heard his mother's voice. He remembered sitting by candlelight, shivering under a thermal blanket while the wind tried to tear the roof off their house. He had been terrified that the emergency radio had gone silent. "Don't panic, Bren," she had told him, her hands steady as she checked the manual safety locks on the reinforced storm shutters. "Machines break, wires snap. The grid always goes down eventually. When the system dies, the people have to become the system." Bren opened his eyes. The ambient violet light of the orbital academy no longer felt oppressive. The dull ache in his spine faded into the background, while the greatest young minds of the galaxy were drowning in their inability to compute a world without perfection. The boy from the Deathworld simply pressed his stylus to the screen and began to draw a map based on the assumption that everything, absolutely everything, was going to go wrong. The air in the lecture hall crackled with the sheer thermal output of overclocked neural processors. Above the desks of his peers, a dense, chaotic forest of four-dimensional topography bloomed into existence, while Thyre wove a fractal web of probability vectors, attempting to predict the exact path of a blind panic. Bren's carbon fiber stylus scratched rhythmically against his flat screen. He was not building a model. He was writing a checklist. To the highly evolved minds around him, a problem was an equation to be balanced. To Bren, a disaster was a hungry beast. You did not calculate a beast, you built a fence. His architecture of survival was offensively simple, stripping away the elegance of orbital logistics and replacing it with the brutal, frictionless mechanics of human desperation. He asked himself the ugly questions that alien algorithms were designed to ignore. What happens when the bioluminescent exit signs melt into slag? What happens when the designated squad leader gets a skull fracture and stops talking? What happens when the dark makes people so afraid they forget how to walk in a straight line? His entire solution revolved around a single, archaic principle: decentralized survival. If the head is severed, the body must still know how to crawl. He drew up a network of localized rally points, each entirely blind to the existence of the others. There was no master synchronization. If Sector 4 went dark, Sector 5 did not need an update from a central hub to know they had to bar their own doors and ration their own water. Every isolated cluster of refugees became its own sovereign nation of survival. Into this crude framework, Bren injected details that would have looked like absolute madness to any civilized galactic engineer. He specified that navigation routes be painted not at eye level, where sophisticated optical sensors would naturally scan, but as a continuous line of photoluminescent pigment running a mere 6 inches above the floor deck. Smoke rises, his notes explained bluntly. If you can see the ceiling, you are already dead. He mandated physical guide ropes strung along primary corridors. For species that communicated via localized quantum entanglement, the idea of grabbing a physical cord was absurd. But Bren went further, requiring standardized, tactile knots tied at regular intervals along the nylon. A double overhand knot meant a structural hazard ahead. A figure 8 meant a medical cache. A loop meant a dead end. If the atmospheric dust blinded you and the magnetic storm deafened your communication receivers, your hands could still read the environment. He replaced the standard digitized health telemetry with color-coded physical tags. Red for arterial bleeding, yellow for broken bones, green for the walking wounded, black for the ones you leave behind. Instead of complex biometric tracking, he instituted a mandatory convention: walk in pairs. Count heads at every doorway. Use physical hand signs when the roaring wind drowns out voices. Use standardized, rhythm-coded whistle blasts to penetrate audio interference. 1 long blast for stop, 2 short blasts for move, 3 continuous blasts for immediate cover. He mapped out a shift clock based entirely on biological exhaustion markers, completely independent of the colony's central timekeeping matrix. He tapped the final period onto his screen. He checked his internal chronometer. Barely 14 minutes had passed since the professor had issued the prompt. He swept his hand across the tablet, compiling the raw, unencrypted text and 2-dimensional diagrams into a rudimentary file, and swiped it toward the central academic server. Then, with the serene detachment of someone waiting for a public transport shuttle, he closed out of the testing application, pulled up a dense, multi-layered text on celestial mechanics, and began reviewing his notes for his next lecture. The sudden absence of his stylus scratching against the screen drew the attention of the students seated nearest to him. Orelk paused his frantic neural data streaming for a fraction of a second, his secondary eyelids fluttering open to cast a look of profound, heavy pity at the human. Thyre's anti-gravity field dipped slightly, a physical manifestation of her sorrow. To them, the situation was brutally obvious. The primitive exchange student had hit a cognitive wall. He had looked at the immense, terrifying complexity of a decentralized evacuation matrix, and his underdeveloped brain had simply given up. In their cultures, yielding to an unsolvable equation was a recognized, albeit tragic, intellectual limit. They felt genuine sorrow that the human could not grasp the fundamental architecture of the problem. The soft, rhythmic chime of Professor Quor's crystalline body moving across the amphitheater floor cut through the digital hum of the room. She was observing the rapid, frantic progress of her students, her internal light casting a cool, judgmental blue hue across their holographic projections. She glided past Arelk's crumbling probability matrices and stopped directly beside Bren's desk. She did not ask why he was reading celestial mechanics during a failure theory exam. She merely focused her multifaceted optic ridge on the central server interface, pulling up his submitted file onto her private viewing pane. Bren kept his eyes on his textbook, politely pretending not to notice the towering entity standing less than 3 feet away. For a long moment, there was no sound but the frantic tapping and neural humming of the rest of the class. Then, the ambient temperature around the professor dropped. The steady, analytical blue light, radiating from deep within her silicon lattice, fractured. It shifted abruptly to a rapid, pulsing sequence of deep violet and sharp, blinding silver. It was a physical reaction that no student in the Orbital Academy had ever witnessed. Quor was a creature of absolute mathematical certainty. She did not exhibit surprise. Yet, the light cascading through her chest cavity was chaotic, almost erratic, as she read through the crude diagrams of knotted ropes and floor-level reflective paint. Her optical sensors locked onto the brutal logic of assuming the designated leader would die, and building the system to run on the instincts of the terrified survivors left behind. She did not grade his paper. She did not speak a single word. The towering professor turned away from Bren's desk, her internal light still flashing in that unsettling, rapid cycle, and glided swiftly back to the instructional dais. Instead of continuing her patrol of the struggling class, she bypassed the standard grading interface entirely. She reached into the primary terminal and entered a complex biometric sequence that unlocked a deeply restricted, professor-level data vault. The subtle, urgent change in her behavior acted like a localized gravity well. One by one, the alien geniuses in the room paused their frantic simulations. The complex 4-dimensional holograms above their desks began to lag as their absolute concentration broke. A quiet, unnerved murmuring rippled through the amphitheater. The brightest minds in the Orion Spur looked from the crystalline professor, bathed in the glow of classified historical data, back to the human who was calmly highlighting a paragraph on orbital decay. A cold, unsettling realization began to creep into the room. The most primitive, hastily drawn submission in the Academy had not failed the prompt. It had touched upon something entirely unexpected, something terrifying enough to make a creature of pure logic change her colors. The chime echoing through the amphitheater was sharp, cutting off the intense neural hum of 60 alien prodigies. Nearly an hour had passed. The crystalline entity at the front of the room tapped the central console. "Time is called," Professor Quor chimed. The ambient light of the room shifted from violet to a stark, interrogative white. "Mr. Holloway, please step down to the dais." A collective shift in posture rippled across the tiered seating. Dozens of multifaceted eyes, thermal receptors, and neural sensors pivoted toward the back row. The expectation was heavy and uniform. They were anticipating a public dissection. They expected the technologically stunted human to sweat, stammer, and ultimately apologize for failing to grasp the multidimensional complexities of the assignment. Bren closed his textbook on celestial mechanics, stood up, and walked down the steep steps. He did not look nervous. He looked mildly inconvenienced. Reaching the center floor, he did not interface with the podium's neural bridge. He simply tapped his archaic screen, projecting his 2-dimensional, unencrypted schematic onto the massive holoplay above, next to the sprawling, glowing fractal structures of his classmates. Bren's solution looked like a child's crayon drawing. It was nothing but crude lines, static symbols, and raw text. "Explain your architectural philosophy, Mr. Holloway," the professor commanded, her inner light pulsing with a cold, metallic silver. Bren looked up at his own messy diagram, then turned to the silent, judging audience. "It is not a philosophy. It is a sequence of regressions," he stated, his voice flat and perfectly steady. "If the primary electrical grid dies, the survivors use the low-level photoluminescent color strips. If the structural integrity fails and the color is buried under debris, they use the physical guide ropes. If the thermal heat snaps the ropes, they use the acoustic rhythm codes. If the magnetic storm deafens the acoustic space, they default to the fixed, time-based rendezvous schedules. There is no central command. There is no overarching network to maintain." From the third row, Orelk stood up abruptly, his secondary eyelids snapping open to glare down at the human. "That is aggressively primitive," the Kezan prodigy challenged, his translated voice dripping with mathematical offense. "It is unacceptably heavy. It lacks any semblance of systemic elegance. Your model introduces hundreds of individual physical failure points. A frayed rope or a misread color tag could cascade into localized doom." Bren looked directly at Orelk. "You are entirely correct. It will break. That is exactly why I built it, so it can break and still run." Before Orelk could process the sheer contradiction of that statement, Thyre floated forward, her anti-gravity field humming with agitated energy. "You are relying on whistles, painted arrows, and manual head counts, human. These are prehistoric tools. You are treating a modern orbital crisis like a cave-in. A level 9 magnetic storm stripping away all quantum technology turns an orbital outpost into a cave." Bren fired back without missing a beat. "Under those parameters, prehistoric is significantly more reliable than arrogance." The entire room gasped. To accuse the Helix Array elite of arrogance was a severe breach of academic decorum. Professor Quor did not reprimand him. Instead, her voice rang out with absolute authority. "We will test the hypothesis, engaging the maximum tier disaster engine, level Alpha Omega." The amphitheater shuddered. The professor was not just running a standard statistical review. She was unleashing a simulation so aggressive it was typically reserved for postgraduate structural autopsies. The holographic projector at the front of the room expanded, swallowing the entire lower half of the hall in a massive, three-dimensional rendering of the doomed colony. "Injecting variables," Quor announced. "Saturating the atmosphere with hyperconductive metallic dust, triggering zero-visibility panic protocols, inducing mass auditory hallucination and semantic mistranslation in the surviving population, initiating localized rolling blackouts and unpredictable structural collapse." First, the professor loaded the aggregate solutions of the class. The simulation was a slaughter. Orelk had designed an absolutely flawless, dynamic routing algorithm. But the moment the hyperconductive dust corrupted the localized sensors, the algorithm tried to correct itself. It fed false density readings into the surviving network. The class watched in absolute horror as Orelk's perfectly elegant system confidently directed 3,000 simulated colonists into a dead-end corridor, resulting in a fatal crush. Thyre's complex, decentralized digital mapping system fared no better. The semantic mistranslation variable caused the automated digital signage to scramble. Her beautifully coded, node-based rescue logic fractured. Emergency response teams received conflicting coordinates. The class watched holographic medics physically block each other from entering burning sectors, trapped in a digital logic loop, while the people they were supposed to save suffocated. One by one, the brilliant, genius-level systems collapsed. The moment their high-tech connective tissue was severed, the individual parts went blind, panicked, and effectively murdered the colony. "Resetting parameters," the professor intoned, over the horrified silence of her students. "Loading the Holloway regression matrix." Bren's ugly, two-dimensional drawing overlaid the burning colony. The simulation began again. The hyperconductive dust tore through the corridors. The digital screens exploded. The automated doors jammed shut. But then, the class saw something alien to their understanding of order. In Sector 4, the designated commander was immediately crushed by a falling bulkhead. In any other model, that sector would freeze, awaiting a chain of command override. Instead, the simulated colonists simply looked at the lowest-ranking surviving officer. The officer blew 2 short blasts on a physical whistle. The colonists grabbed the nylon rope bolted to the wall. They began to walk. They moved agonizingly slowly. It was painfully inefficient. There were no optimal routes. They had to stop at every single blast door to manually crank it open. They had to pause every 10 meters to conduct a physical head count, patting each other on the shoulder in the pitch black. The simulation threw a structural fire right across their path, incinerating the guide rope. The alien students leaned forward, expecting the group to finally disintegrate into chaos. Instead, the simulated colonists dropped to their hands and knees, found the low-level photoluminescent paint glowing beneath the smoke layer, and simply altered their trajectory toward the nearest green-coated marker. It was a brutal, ugly, grinding process. Bren's system did not prevent casualties. People still fell. Injuries still occurred, but the total, cascading collapse never materialized. When the command structure failed, the manual protocols caught the weight. When the visual aids burned, the tactile systems took over. When the tactile systems snapped, the localized time schedules forced the separated groups to blindly walk toward predetermined rallying coordinates. Bren's design was not a flawless crystal glass. It was a sack of rocks. You could smash it with a hammer all day long, and in the end, you were still left with a sack of rocks. The 72-hour timer expired. The simulation froze. The survival statistics hovered in the air, glowing with undeniable, brutal clarity. The aggregate class survival rate was 9.4%. Bren Holloway's survival rate was 87.6%. The silence in the amphitheater was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet born from the sudden, violent shattering of a worldview. 60 alien prodigies stared at the crude, low-tech schematic hovering in the air, completely unable to process how a lack of intelligence had outsmarted them all. Professor Quor turned away from the holoplay. Her internal light had settled into a deep, solid gold. She looked up at the tiered seating, ensuring every single student was listening. "Analyze the failure," she commanded, her voice cutting through the quiet like a surgical laser. "You failed because of your pride. You designed your systems to prove to the universe that your intellect is perfect. You built intricate, delicate machines that required absolute obedience from the environment." She turned her multifaceted gaze back to the human, standing calmly at the center of the room. "He," Quor stated, the word echoing off the curved walls, "designed his architecture to accept that everything will betray him. His system survived because he did not demand perfection from the universe. He expected the universe to try and kill him." The chime, signaling the end of the instructional block, rang out, but the usual orderly exodus of the orbital academy did not occur. Instead, a loose, hesitant semicircle formed around Bren's workstation. The alien prodigies did not approach with hostility. They looked at him the way a physicist might look at an apple that suddenly decided to fall upward. They were genuinely, deeply bewildered. Thyre drifted slightly closer, her anti-gravity field humming a low note of anxiety. She tilted her head, observing him. "Human," she began, her translated voice sounding almost fragile. "What is the origin of this psychological fixation? Why is your mind so heavily anchored to the concept of absolute, unmitigated disaster?" Bren paused, while sliding his drawing tablet into his canvas bag. He looked at the circle of expectant, multifaceted eyes. "It is not a fixation," he replied, zipping the bag shut. "It is just normal life. You have to plan for things breaking. The power grid goes down during severe storms. Wildfires take out communication relays. You might get caught in a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate during a blizzard, or break an ankle while mountain climbing miles away from a suburban rescue unit. You just prepare for the worst and hope for the best." Orelk, the Kezan math prodigy, blinked his secondary eyelids rapidly. "You speak of these catastrophic systemic failures as if they are routine occurrences." "Because they are," Bren said, slinging the strap over his shoulder. "Earth is chaotic. When I was 5 years old, my mother taught me how to memorize my home address, my blood type, and the emergency contact frequencies. By the time we were 7 years old, our primary education instructors were running us through active fire drills. We were taught how to drop low under the smoke, how to check doors for heat, and how to apply a basic tourniquet to a bleeding limb. If you get lost in the woods, you learn to stay put, build a visible signal, and ration your water." The semicircle of students physically recoiled. A collective wave of horror washed through the group. To them, Bren had just casually described a grueling, brutal, military indoctrination designed for elite shock troops, not the standard curriculum for primary school children. A Cillian student named Lyra, whose pale blue skin shivered slightly, rapidly tapped her personal terminal. She projected a public galactic database file into the space between them. The planetary classification for Earth glowed in a harsh, warning red. "It is a Class 9 Deathworld," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. She read the environmental statistics aloud to the group. Erratic tectonic instability, resulting in unpredictable seismic events. Extreme atmospheric volatility, producing cyclonic storms capable of leveling urban infrastructure. Highly aggressive microbial life. Crushing gravitational pressure relative to the galactic standard. A biosphere populated entirely by hyper-competitive, apex predatory organisms. It states here that prolonged exposure is lethal to 99% of known civilized species. The alien students stared at Bren with a mixture of profound pity and primal fear. They were looking at a creature forged in a biological hell. Bren looked at the glowing red text and frowned. He felt a strange sense of dissonance. They read those statistics and saw a nightmare, an unlivable nightmare of suffering and constant terror. Bren just saw summer thunderstorms, hiking trails, and the ocean. "It is not hell," Bren said quietly, adjusting his bag. "It is just home. You respect the planet, and you do not expect it to be nice to you. That is all." His casual acceptance of a lethal environment shocked them far more than the statistics. They parted silently, allowing him to walk down the aisle and exit the amphitheater, their eyes following him until the heavy blast doors hissed shut. Later that evening, the artificial day-night cycle of the Helix Array transitioned into a muted, twilight phase. The corridors were quiet, illuminated by soft amber guidance tracks. Bren was in his quarters, reviewing an incredibly dense chapter on quantum fluid dynamics, when a priority notification chimed on his terminal. It was a direct summons from Professor Seraphine Quor. He navigated the empty halls to her private office. The space was devoid of biological comforts. There were no chairs, no soft lighting, only towering racks of crystalline data drives and a central podium where the professor stood. Her internal light was no longer the sharp, interrogative white of the classroom. It had settled into a dim, melancholic blue. "Enter, Mr. Holloway." Her harmonic voice resonated in the quiet room. Bren stepped inside, the doors sealing shut behind him with a heavy thud. "I assume you called me here to formally fail my assignment," Bren said, keeping his tone respectful but direct. I understand that my solution did not utilize any of the advanced technologies the curriculum requires. I ignored the quantum relay protocols entirely. You are not here for a disciplinary review, Professor Quor replied, turning her massive, faceted form toward him. You are here because you need to understand the true nature of the exercise you completed today. She tapped the podium. The holographic projector embedded in the floor sprang to life, but it did not display a sterile, geometric simulation. It displayed raw, historical footage. Bren saw the interior of a sprawling, highly advanced colony. The architecture was stunning, all sweeping curves and pristine white composite materials. But the footage was grainy, caught by a struggling backup camera. The colony was dark, thick. Choking dust swirled through the corridors. In the background, Bren could see silhouettes of people huddled together, unmoving, while automated doors repeatedly slammed open and shut in a broken, corrupted rhythm. This was the Aegis Prime frontier settlement, Professor Quor intoned, her voice heavy with an ancient, unresolved grief. 82 standard cycles ago, they were hit by a level 9 stellar magnetic storm. Exactly as the prompt detailed, the entire quantum network went dark in an instant. Bren watched the footage, his chest tightening. This was not a theoretical scenario. No, the professor confirmed. It was a historical autopsy. When the network died, the colony's central artificial intelligence froze. The automated medical bays locked down because they could not verify patient identities. The atmospheric scrubbers shut off because they could not ping the central hub for clearance. And the people. She paused, the blue light inside her dimming to a barely perceptible glow. The people sat in the dark and waited for the system to reboot. Bren stared at the frozen, huddled figures in the hologram. Why did they not force the doors open? Why did they not just walk out? Because they were civilized, Quor said bitterly. They had never known a world where a door did not open automatically. They had never known a world where the floor did not tell them exactly where to go. They trusted the network completely. They waited for 48 hours. By the time they realized the system was never coming back online, the oxygen levels had dropped below the critical threshold. 4,200 individuals perished. The entire colony was lost. A cold chill crept up Bren's spine. The abstract numbers from the classroom simulation suddenly had faces, names, and a terrifying reality. He had treated the assignment like a logic puzzle, a simple exercise in wilderness survival. He had not realized he was looking at a mass grave. I have taught this course for 40 years. Professor Quor continued, her crystalline structure chiming softly as she moved. I have given that exact prompt to thousands of the brightest minds the galaxy has ever produced. Every single one of them, without fail, attempted to solve the problem by saving the system. They tried to invent a better routing algorithm. They tried to build a stronger quantum shield. They tried to code an artificial intelligence that could survive the storm. She looked down at Bren, her multifaceted eyes catching the amber light of the corridor outside. None of them ever tried to save the people after the system was already dead, she said softly. None of them could comprehend a reality where the technology simply abandons them. You are the very first student in the history of this academy to look at the death of a civilization's infrastructure and simply decide to use a rope and some paint. Bren swallowed hard. He did not feel like a genius. He did not feel like a prodigy who had just outsmarted an entire galaxy. He just felt an overwhelming, hollow sadness. His solution was not brilliant. It was just the grim, practical reality of what his family had done when the floodwaters rose back on Earth. It is not brilliance, Professor, Bren said quietly. It is just survival. On my world, we learn early that the universe does not care if you are comfortable. And that is precisely why I brought you here tonight, Professor Quor said, her internal light flashing with a sudden, intense silver warning. She deactivated the holographic footage, plunging the room back into shadows. Your peers view you as a primitive novelty, she stated, her harmonic voice dropping to a low, serious frequency. They believe your lack of technological reliance makes you weak. But they are fundamentally wrong. They do not see the absolute ruthlessness of your methodology. She stepped closer to him, towering over his human frame. They look at a perfect system and assume it will last forever. What makes you dangerous, Mr. Holloway, is not your intellect. It is the fact that you view collapse as a default assumption. Rumors traveled faster than quantum telemetry on the Helix array. By the start of the next orbital cycle, the boy from the red classified Deathworld was no longer the invisible, technologically stunted exchange student. He had become a walking anomaly. He was the sole topic of conversation in the bioluminescent lounges and the zero-gravity cafeterias. The alien prodigies did not whisper about him because he possessed a superior intellect or a higher processing speed. They whispered because his aggressively human way of thinking had violently exposed a fatal, rotting blind spot in the psychology of their entire perfected civilization. A small, nervous cluster of students gathered on the observation deck of the primary recreation concourse. Their multifaceted eyes locked onto the synthetic environmental training chamber below. Inside the chamber, a sheer, artificial cliff face stretched upward, designed to simulate the jagged basalt formations of an arid moon. The safety protocols for the wall were strict. A climber was required to wear a kinetic dampening harness and could only ascend a maximum of 10 meters before the automated repulsor fields caught them. Bren Holloway was currently 30 meters in the air. He wore no kinetic harness. He had manually overridden the automated repulsor fields using a physical maintenance switch he found near the floor. His fingers were jammed into a narrow, jagged fissure in the synthetic rock. His muscles shook with exhaustion, a sheen of sweat coating his forehead as he reached blindly for the next handhold. He slipped, his boots scraping against the sheer surface, and the watching group of alien students collectively gasped, their various anti-gravity fields and bioluminescent patches flaring in sheer, unadulterated terror. He caught himself by 2 fingers, grunted, and hauled his weight upward. When he finally descended, dropping the last few meters to land heavily on the padded floor, the cluster of students approached him as if he were an unexploded piece of ordnance. A gelatinous, semi-transparent student from the Uzian collective bubbled nervously. Human Bren, the structural integrity of your biological frame would have suffered catastrophic fragmentation if your grip had failed. Why did you disengage the safety repulsors and exceed the recreational altitude limit by 3 times the authorized parameter? Bren wiped the chalk from his hands onto his athletic trousers, breathing heavily. I just wanted to test my grip strength. You cannot really test how hard you can hold on to something if you know a machine is going to catch you when you let go. The Uzian shuddered, its internal nucleus rapidly changing color. The idea of deliberately removing a safety net just to experience the biological threat of gravity was profoundly disturbing. Nemvox, a towering, chitin-plated student, renowned across the sector as a peerless strategist in resource management theory, stepped forward. His mandibles clicked in a rhythmic, challenging cadence. Physical endurance is irrelevant in the grand scheme of survival. Holloway, true resilience is built through flawless logistical optimization. Play a cycle with me. Bren found himself dragged to a holographic gaming table in the center of the lounge. The game was a wildly popular orbital simulation called Imperium Logistics. The objective was to build and maintain a star-spanning civilization while competing for scarce stellar resources. In the first round, Bren lost spectacularly. He spent the entire match just trying to understand the complex, multi-layered holographic interface, accidentally starving his own digital population while Nemvox constructed a breathtaking, hyper-efficient Dyson swarm that monopolized the board. The alien spectators trilled with approval. This was the natural order of things. Again, Nemvox clicked, resetting the board. In the second round, Nemvox immediately began constructing another beautiful, interconnected network of orbital trade hubs. Every single node was perfectly reliant on the others, creating a stunningly efficient web of digital prosperity. Bren did not build a trade network. He poured every single digital resource he had into constructing crude, unguided kinetic thrusters. He strapped them to the largest virtual asteroids he could find in his territory. While Nemvox was optimizing his central taxation algorithm, Bren launched the rocks directly at Nem's central agricultural distribution hub. The hub shattered, because Nem's entire empire was flawlessly interconnected to avoid redundancy. The loss of the single hub caused a cascading starvation event. The glorious, highly advanced civilization collapsed into dust in exactly 3 turns. The lounge went dead silent. "That was a statistical anomaly," Nemvox hissed, his mandibles flaring. Again! In the third round, Nem built a massive, impenetrable military arcology, shielding his central processing core behind rings of plasma defenses. Bren ignored the defenses entirely. He spent his resources infiltrating the arcology's automated water filtration subsystem and corrupted the biological scrubbers. The impenetrable fortress suffocated from the inside out. Nemvox slammed his heavy claws onto the table, disrupting the hologram. "That is not how civilized beings wage a conflict. It is utterly lacking in tactical elegance. You are just breaking the central link. If you build a chain with only one important link, you are begging someone to break it," Bren replied, stepping away from the table. "Do not put all your water in one bucket if you cannot afford to drop it." The unease surrounding Bren began to mutate into a bizarre form of academic panic. A frail, multi-eyed archivist student from the historical faculty cornered him near the hydration station later that cycle. The archivist was vibrating with distress, clutching a datapad filled with translated Earth literature. "I have been researching your cultural archives," the archivist whispered, their multiple pupils contracting in horror. "I read about your juvenile recreational activities. Is it true that your offspring engage in a ritual called hide-and-seek?" "Yes," Bren said, taking a sip of water. "It is just a game." "You deliberately condition your young to practice apex predator evasion tactics for amusement," the archivist concluded, their voice trembling. "And this activity called camping. You possess climate-controlled, structurally sound habitats, yet you willingly abandon them to sleep on the raw, unprotected crust of your death world in thin fabric shelters." "It builds character," Bren offered, though he knew the idiom would not translate well. The archivist pressed on, frantically swiping through the datapad. "And your educational priorities. Human children are taught to propel themselves through non-breathable liquid mediums to prevent drowning. You teach them how to manually compress a wounded artery to stop their own life fluids from leaking out." "Yes, we take swimming lessons and basic first aid. But the data states you teach these brutal survival mechanics before you teach them advanced calculus or temporal physics." The archivist looked at him as if he were an alien from another dimension. "Why would you prioritize manual blood retention over mathematics?" Bren just shrugged. "Because that is what you need to use first. Calculus does not help you much if you bleed out on the sidewalk." The cultural shockwave fundamentally altered Bren's status. He transitioned from a pitied, backward primate to a terrifying new academic classification. To the highly advanced scholars of the Helix Array, Bren Holloway was the suboptimal, but unkillable model. He was a living paradox. He represented a biological framework that completely ignored the pursuit of absolute perfection in favor of sheer, stubborn refusal to die. It was a concept that deeply fascinated the faculty, but made the student body profoundly uncomfortable. Truthfully, Bren was equally uncomfortable. He hated the whispers. He did not want to be deified as some sort of chaotic genius of destruction. He was not a tactical mastermind. He was just a normal guy from a deeply imperfect planet. To these alien prodigies, A power outage was a profound, philosophical debate about the fragility of the cosmic order. To Bren, it was just a localized annoyance that meant you had to find a flashlight really fast before you stubbed your toe on the coffee table. As the cycle drew to a close, a sharp, harmonic chime echoed across the Grand Concourse, signaling a mandatory broadcast. The massive holographic notice board above the main thoroughfare flared with bright, urgent colors. The ambient chatter in the corridors died instantly as thousands of students stopped to read the announcement. It was the official posting for the semester-level group project. This was not a theoretical classroom simulation. This was a practical, high-stakes engineering mandate. The text translated rapidly in Bren's field of vision. The Academy was tasking the senior cohorts with designing the complete, physical living infrastructure for the very first permanent colonial settlement on a newly explored frontier planet. Beneath the mandate, the planetary profile flashed in aggressive warning markers. The new world was notorious. It was located in a volatile sector of the Outer Rim, plagued by hyper-frequent electromagnetic storms and characterized by deadly, unpredictable topographical anomalies that defied standard scanning equipment. It was a world that actively hated the idea of civilization. Bren stared at the planetary profile. He looked at the atmospheric warnings, the seismic instability markers, and the absolute lack of an established safety net. Around him, the alien students began to murmur in stressed, panicked frequencies. They were looking at a logistical nightmare. Bren just looked at it and sighed. It looked an awful lot like home. The project suite assigned to them was a vast, circular chamber, lined with obsidian-black sensory screens and floating holographic interface nodes. Professor Quor had not relied on a random academic algorithm to build this group. She had handpicked them, forging a team that the entire Helix Array faculty viewed as a volatile social experiment. Bren Holloway found himself standing in the center of the room, alongside the absolute apex of the student body. There was Aurelk, the Kazan mathematician whose mind processed variables like a quantum supercomputer. There was Thyre, the Veltra behaviorist who could map the psychological trajectory of an entire species. Nem Vox stood tall, his chitinous armor gleaming, representing the peak of resource strategy. Joining them were two new additions. Keshmer was a heavily muscled, silent entity from a hypergravity world, whose people were renowned for engineering planetary mantles. Finally, there was Sailor Ven, a sleek, iridescent avianoid known across the Academy for a terrifyingly ruthless political logic and crippling skepticism. On the official Academy registry, they were the undisputed dream team. In the suffocating air of the project suite, they were a primed thermal detonator waiting for a spark. Their mandate was staggering. The parameters had expanded far beyond a simple 72-hour emergency evacuation. The academic board required them to design the complete, functional living infrastructure for 30,000 initial settlers over their first 18 months on a hostile frontier world. They were responsible for everything. They had to map out deep crust communications, automated medical triage centers, geothermal energy grids, mass transport lines, synthetic agricultural yields, and total disaster recovery protocols. On day one, the alien prodigies went to work, and their combined output was nothing short of miraculous. Bren stood back and watched as they harmonized their immense intellects into a blinding display of architectural artistry. Keshmer and Nem Vox collaborated to draft a colossal central core. It was a subterranean heart, shielded beneath layers of synthetic bedrock, designed to house the colony's entire primary energy reactor, atmospheric processors, and emergency rations. Radiating from this impenetrable vault, Aurelk mathematically wove a flawless, concentric web of distribution lines, ensuring perfect resource equity across every sector. Thyre programmed complex swarms of self-learning repair drones that would patrol these lines, using predictive algorithms to anticipate and repair material fatigue weeks before a physical fracture could occur. By the end of the shift, The holographic projection blooming in the center of their suite was a glowing, golden mandala of absolute efficiency. Every single watt of geothermal energy was accounted for. Every drop of recycled water was tracked. It was a perfectly optimized utopian oasis, a shining monument designed to conquer a brutal frontier through pure, unadulterated intelligence. They had built a masterpiece. Bren walked slowly around the edge of the projection platform. He had been quiet for hours, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. The 5 alien prodigies stepped back, their respective bioluminescence, anti-gravity fields, and mandibles humming with intense, justified pride. They looked to the human, fully expecting him to be awed into silence by the sheer majesty of their civilized engineering. Bren stopped. He looked at the glowing, heavily armored subterranean heart of the colony. He rubbed the back of his neck, let out a slow breath, and asked the exact question that was destined to infuriate every genius in the room. What if that core is lost? The question was spoken quietly, but it hit the ambient silence of the suite like a physical shockwave. The beautiful golden mandala suddenly felt like a fragile, intricate glass sculpture balancing on the edge of a table. Orelk's secondary eyelids snapped open in profound, vibrating irritation. The core is shielded behind 8 meters of hyperdense impact composite, the Kezan argued, his translated voice sharp with mathematical offense. The structural integrity is absolute. The probability of a total core breach, even under the stress of a planetary seismic event, is less than 0.001%. You are deliberately elevating a statistical impossibility into an irrational obsession, human. Nem Vox stepped forward, his heavy claws clicking against the metallic floor. Orelk is correct. Optimization is the only logical method to guarantee the survival of 30,000 organic units. By centralizing the reserves and the power generation, we eliminate distribution waste. We save lives through peak efficiency. Splintering the core creates unacceptable logistical drag. Bren shook his head, pointing a blunt finger at the planetary data scrolling along the wall. A massive electromagnetic storm or a sudden tectonic shear does not care about your math. Disaster does not respect efficiency. Once the catastrophe happens, the probability becomes 100%. If that impenetrable core cracks, or if the distribution lines are severed at the root, all 30,000 people die in the dark because you did not give them a backup plan. The tension in the suite spiked, the ambient lighting flickering as the alien student struggled to process the sheer audacity of his stubbornness. That was when Sailor Ven spoke. The avianoid had been perched on a raised terminal, observing the entire exchange with cold, calculating, iridescent eyes. Sailor let out a sharp, mocking trill that translated into a bitter laugh. He is right about the structural flaw, but all of you are entirely missing the point, Sailor hissed, their voice cutting through the argument like a monomolecular blade. Sailor pointed a slender, feathered digit directly at Bren. Look at him. Professor Quor did not place this primitive on our team to contribute technical data. She put him here to humiliate us. The room went dead silent. She paired the brightest minds of the current academic generation with a creature whose species still burns fossilized carbon for heat. Sailor continued, their tone dripping with cynical venom. She did it to teach us a lesson about our own hubris. He is not a teammate. He is a walking penalty modifier designed to drag our scores down and prove a philosophical point. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and deeply toxic. The atmosphere in the room froze solid. Egos were brutally bruised. Resentment flared bright and hot. Sailor had dragged the unspoken, ugly truth out into the light, and it poisoned their collaborative well in an instant. Orelk turned away in disgust. Thyre's anti-gravity field dropped, sending her settling heavily to the floor. Nem Vox crossed his armored arms, refusing to look at the holographic board. Bren stood his ground, but a cold knot formed in his stomach. He was angry, But the hardest truth of the cycle belonged to him alone. He stared at the beautiful, flawed golden hologram and realized a bitter, undeniable fact. He was excellent at finding the fatal fracture. He possessed the grim instinct to foresee the collapse. But he could not build an 18-month survival grid for 30,000 people using just ropes, glow paint, and whistles. A sprawling, off-world colony required immense, complex power generation. It needed automated atmospheric scrubbers to keep the air breathable, and complex hydroponic yields to prevent mass starvation. He needed their genius. He needed Aurelk's flawless mathematics and Thyray's behavioral coding. He needed Nem's resource allocation and Kesha's geological engineering. He needed the very advanced technology he fundamentally distrusted just to keep his people alive on a dead world. He could tear a bad system down, but he did not have the tools to build a good one from scratch. No one spoke for a very long time. The six of them stood in a loose, fractured, and hostile circle around the massive data wall, bathed in the flickering, dying light of their aborted colony design. The silence was thick with wounded pride and a terrifying realization. They finally understood the true, crushing weight of the professor's mandate. They were no longer just trying to pass a semester-level orbital engineering course. As they stared down at the glowing blueprints of a new world, they realized they were locked in a profound, ideological war. They were standing at the edge of the frontier, fiercely debating whether a civilization deserved to be built upon a blinding faith in its own perfection, or a humble, ugly acceptance of total chaos. The first 7 days of the semester project dissolved into a toxic, grinding stalemate. Inside the circular obsidian suite, the air grew thick with unspoken resentments and the harsh, flashing red hues of failed holographic simulations. Bren's team of prodigies possessed the raw intellect to engineer a paradise. But their paradise was fundamentally allergic to reality. Every time Aurelk, Nemvox, and Thyray compiled a breathtaking new iteration of the colony, they would proudly feed it into the Academy's random disaster engine. And every single time, the beautiful, hyper-efficient architecture tore itself to pieces. The failures always stemmed from the same arrogant assumptions. The alien designers relied on the premise that a central command hub would remain perfectly intact. They assumed that emergency logistics would flow along standardized schedules. Above all, they calculated their survival rates based on the unwavering belief that terrified, organic colonists would execute emergency protocols with the flawless precision of a machine. Bren became the resident executioner of their dreams. He did not build. He merely stood at the edge of the projection platform, hands in his pockets, and dismantled their hard work with blunt, exhausting hypotheticals. When Thyray presented a flawlessly synchronized evacuation route for the residential sectors, Bren pointed at the primary command node and asked what would happen if the local operator suffered a severe panic attack and locked the primary bulkheads instead of opening them. When Aurelk coded a brilliant, automated medical distribution web, Bren asked what the sector would do if the diagnostic signals were violently mistranslated by a localized magnetic surge. When Nemvox proudly displayed a centralized hydroponic nutrient reserve that served the entire settlement, Bren simply asked what would happen if a residential block was physically severed from the transport network for 5 consecutive days. To the highly evolved minds in the room, Bren was not offering constructive criticism. He was a vandal throwing rocks at stained glass. The breaking point arrived halfway through the cycle. Sailor Ven, the iridescent avianoid, slammed a feathered fist against the control console. The holographic projection shattered into static. Sailor's plumage flared in a terrifying display of predatory aggression, their dark eyes locked onto the human. "Enough!" Sailor hissed, the translation matrix struggling to capture the sheer venom in the tone. "You are deliberately sabotaging our progress. You contribute absolutely nothing to the infrastructural mathematics. Yet you demand we degrade our designs to accommodate impossible, statistically irrelevant tragedies. You are trying to drag a Tier 1 orbital settlement down to the primitive, mud-dwelling standards of your Deathworld. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Bren did not shrug it off. He did not offer a polite, deferential nod. He stepped away from the wall, closing the distance between himself and the towering avianoid. His voice was no longer a calm drawl. It was hard, cold, and echoing with sudden authority. Being primitive is significantly less shameful than burying 30,000 people because you were too arrogant to build a backup plan, Bren snapped, his gaze unyielding. Your designs are beautiful, sailor. They belong in a museum. But the moment the sky catches fire and the ground cracks open, your beautiful efficiency becomes a mass grave. You are so obsessed with proving how smart you are that you are forgetting we are supposed to be keeping people alive. The suite fell into a horrified, electric silence. No one had ever spoken to an avianoid noble with such blatant disrespect. Sailor vibrated with fury, ready to escalate the conflict to a formal academic duel. But Nemvox stepped between them, forcefully ordering a mandatory cooling-off period. The team scattered to separate corners of the room, the collaborative spirit thoroughly poisoned. Seeking refuge from the suffocating tension, Bren retreated to a secondary terminal. He pulled up the raw, unedited geological and atmospheric surveys of the frontier planet they were assigned to colonize. He needed to find a way to translate his fears into their language. He needed hard data. He began running comparative algorithms, matching the new planet's tectonic instability markers, the frequency of its atmospheric dust storms, and the specific radiation signatures of its stellar weather. As the data scrolled across his screen, a cold, heavy feeling settled in his chest. The numbers looked familiar. They looked entirely too familiar. He bypassed the standard academic firewalls, digging into the restricted historical archives he had accessed during his private meeting with Professor Quor. He pulled up the classified autopsy report of the Aegis Prime colony. He placed the two datasets side by side. The tectonic fault line distributions matched perfectly. The chemical composition of the hyperconductive dust was identical. The interval and intensity of the stellar magnetic storms aligned down to the exact decimal. The frontier world was not a new, randomly generated challenge. It was a mirrored recreation. Professor Quor was not merely teaching a theoretical design course. She had disguised the very disaster that had killed over 4,000 colonists and handed it to the brightest students of the current generation. She was silently testing them to see if they would walk blindly into the exact same trap, to see if an entirely new civilization would build the exact same tomb. Bren immediately pushed away from the terminal. "Look at this," he demanded, projecting the comparative data onto the central holoplay. "All of you, look at the screen right now." The team reluctantly gathered around the projection. Bren quickly walked them through the identical data points, explaining the horrific history of the Aegis Prime collapse. He told them about the colonists who had suffocated in the dark because they trusted a centralized system that never rebooted. He explained that the professor was actively baiting them into repeating a historical slaughter. Instead of horror, Bren was met with a wall of absolute, icy skepticism. Orelt crossed his arms, his secondary eyelids fluttering in annoyance. "This is a desperate fabrication. Holloway, you manipulated the search parameters to force a correlation. You are attempting to weaponize historical tragedy to manipulate the design architecture in your favor." "It is a pathetic psychological tactic," Sailor added, turning their back on the projection. "You cannot win the mathematical argument, so you are trying to induce a panic state. We will not be governed by your primitive paranoia." Trust within the team completely evaporated. They looked at Bren not just as a hindrance, but as a deceitful manipulator, trying to drag their academic standing into the dirt to validate his own trauma. "Fine," Bren said quietly, stepping back from the console. "Do not believe me. Run your models. Run them right now." Thyre floated forward, her anti-gravity field humming with indignant energy. I will demonstrate the absolute stability of the revised residential module. I have integrated NEM's central power routing with Orelk's distribution logic. It is flawless. She booted up a localized simulation of Sector 4, housing exactly 7,000 colonists. The holographic residential block glowed a healthy, vibrant blue. The automated systems hummed in perfect harmony. I will now introduce a minor, isolated variable, just to prove the resilience of the network, Thyre announced proudly. I am inputting a localized jamming frequency, targeting the single primary signal station for this sector. A minor communication blackout. She executed the command. The central signal station in the simulation went dark. Immediately, the automated environmental doors, requiring a digital handshake from the station to verify safe oxygen levels, locked shut to prevent a perceived atmospheric breach. The ventilation scrubbers, unable to receive their efficiency schedules, shifted into a low-power standby mode. The colonists inside the simulation moved toward the exits, but the doors would not open without central clearance. Because Orelk's flawless design prevented any manual overrides to maintain absolute security, the simulated people could not turn the handles. Because NEM's optimized power grid relied on the central signal to allocate energy, the lights in the sector turned off to conserve power for the paralyzed doors. The team watched in paralyzed silence as the oxygen levels inside the sealed, darkened residential block began to plummet. The simulation rapidly accelerated the timeline. The glowing blue structures turned a sickly yellow, then a harsh, flashing orange. Within exactly 4 simulated hours, the entire sector turned a dead, flat red. 7,000 simulated colonists perished. They did not die from a massive explosion or a dramatic planetary earthquake. They died entirely because a single, centralized communication node experienced a temporary glitch, and the perfectly optimized system decided it was safer to seal them in a box than to let them manually open a window. The error message hovered over the holographic graveyard, casting a bloody hue across the faces of the alien prodigies. No one argued. No one offered a mathematical excuse. Sailor Ven stared at the red casualty counter, their feathers pressed flat against their body in absolute horror. Thyre's anti-gravity field faltered, dropping her a few inches closer to the floor. Orelk's rapid neural twitching ceased completely. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, lasting for several long minutes. The undeniable truth of the failure hung around their necks like an anvil. Finally, Kashmir shifted. The massive, heavily muscled entity from the high-gravity world had barely spoken a single sentence since the team was formed. Kesh slowly reached out a massive, dense hand and deactivated the flashing red error message, plunging the suite into a dim, sobering shadow. Kesh turned their heavy, deep-set eyes toward the rest of the group, their voice rumbling like grinding tectonic plates. Perhaps the problem is not that Bren is too pessimistic, Kashmir rumbled quietly. Perhaps the problem is that our entire civilization has never learned how to imagine an ugly truth. The heavy silence of Kashmir's realization hung in the air for a full solar cycle. When they returned to the Obsidian Suite on the first day of the second week, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, uncomfortable humility. Bren realized that simply holding up a mirror to their flaws was no longer sufficient. If they were going to survive this project, he had to stop acting like a wrecking ball and start acting like a translator. He needed to take the crude, muddy logic of Earth survival and encode it into the pristine mathematics of the Orion Spur. He had to give them a way to build the very thing they feared. He approached Orelk first. Bren did not ask the Kezan mathematician to abandon his love for optimization. He asked him to optimize the isolation. Orelk's secondary eyelids fluttered as the mathematical challenge took root. Instead of relying on a single, massive central reactor, Orelk fractured the colony's power grid into a decentralized constellation of autonomous microgrids. He wrote a brilliant, localized viability algorithm. If the central core went dark, these independent clusters automatically engaged deep geothermal taps. Each microgrid was mathematically guaranteed to maintain minimum atmospheric heat, water filtration, and emergency medical stasis for 7 consecutive days without a single whisper of outside instruction. Next was Thyre. Bren explained the human concept of breadcrumbs, of leaving a trail that did not rely on a battery to function. The Veltra behaviorist did not reach for physical nylon rope. She reached into advanced biological engineering. She cultivated a hybrid strand of hyper-resilient orbital lichen, splicing it with light memory polymers. She wove this living architecture directly into the colony's baseboards and bulkheads. During normal operations, the organisms fed on ambient artificial light, completely invisible to the naked eye. But the moment the power grid failed and the corridors plunged into darkness, the walls themselves would bleed a soft, radiant, unkillable green. When the digital network died, the physical path would glow with the undeniable clarity of pure instinct. Nem Vox, the grand strategist, tackled the command infrastructure. He finally accepted the human premise that artificial intelligence would eventually hallucinate or crash under severe magnetic duress. His solution was a masterpiece of parallel engineering. Every single control console in the colony, from the massive atmospheric scrubbers to the localized residential airlocks, was designed with a dual interface. The primary board was the standard, sleek, neural-linked hologram. But directly beneath it sat a brutal, heavy mechanical panel. It featured physical hydraulic levers, color-coded manual switches, and acoustic rhythm generators. Vox drafted a planetary mandate. No colonist was permitted to operate the advanced interface unless they could also blindly operate the mechanical board, using only tactile feedback and sound. Keshmir, the silent giant, completely dismantled the societal hierarchy of the settlement. On highly evolved worlds, the division of labor was absolute. Engineers engineered, and civilians consumed. Kesh shattered that paradigm, drafting a universal survival curriculum. There would be no helpless civilians on the frontier. Every single organic unit, regardless of their primary profession, would undergo mandatory, rigorous cross-training. An agricultural botanist had to know how to manually seal a breached hull. A temporal physicist had to be certified in trauma triage and biological quarantine protocols. Everyone had to know how to manually operate the nearest localized rescue station. When the designated experts died, the general populace would seamlessly step into the void. The most shocking contribution, however, came from the fiercest opponent. Sailor Ven, the cynical avianoid who had accused Bren of deliberate sabotage, stared at the updated holographic model for hours. Then, with a cold, predatory grace, Sailor introduced the most expensive, controversial twist of the entire design. Sailor argued that if a digital virus, a raging chemical fire, or a hyper-aggressive localized pathogen broke out, a connected network was just a perfectly paved highway for death. The avianoid mandated that every single residential cluster must possess the absolute, unoverridable physical right to sever itself completely from the main colony. They could drop massive physical bulkheads, sever the power conduits, and physically cut their own data cables. It was a horrifying concept to a deeply interconnected galactic society, representing the deliberate, sanctioned amputation of a colony's own limbs to save the heart. By the end of the month, their completed model hovered in the center of the room, compared to the breathtaking, crystalline spires and sweeping, elegant arcs of the other student teams. Their project looked hideous. It was bulky, aggressively redundant, and astronomically expensive to construct. It lacked all aesthetic symmetry. It looked like a heavily armored, scarred beast crouching in the dirt. But then, they fed the beast into the Academy's disaster engine. They did not just run a single catastrophe, they ran compounding nightmares. They hit the simulation with a Category 5 seismic shear, followed immediately by an Alpha-class magnetic storm and a localized atmospheric hull breach. The beautiful, optimized models of the other teams shattered like fragile glass, their single points of failure instantly condemning tens of thousands of simulated lives to the void. Their ugly beast did not shatter. It reacted. When the magnetic storm scrambled the central artificial intelligence, Nemvox's mechanical analog boards caught the panicked operators, allowing them to manually stabilize the air pressure. When the seismic shear crushed the main power conduits, Orelk's microgrids instantly ignited, keeping the isolated sectors warm and breathing in the pitch black. When the dust blinded the optical sensors, Thyray's biological lichen pulsed to life along the baseboards, guiding the terrified civilians directly to Kesha's localized triage centers. And when the hull breach threatened to rip the atmosphere from the entire Eastern Hemisphere, Sailor's brutal amputation protocols triggered automatically, physically dropping multi-ton blast doors and violently cutting the dying sectors loose to save the remaining 70% of the population. The model bled. It shed its outer layers. It broke into fractured, bruised pieces. But it did not suffer a catastrophic collapse. The core biological life inside it, stubbornly, violently refused to die. Standing shoulder to shoulder with his alien teammates, bathed in the glow of their bruised but breathing colony, Bren Holloway felt a profound shift. This was no longer a case of the advanced galaxy merely learning a painful lesson from a primitive human. They had not just passively adopted his paranoia, they had weaponized their own incredible brilliance to accommodate it. A completely new intellectual organism was taking shape in that room. It was the breathtaking, mathematical elegance of the cosmos, wrapped tightly around the unyielding, ugly stubbornness of Earth. The Great Hall of the Helix Array Orbital Academy was not a classroom. It was an amphitheater designed for the judgment of civilizations. On the day of the final presentation, the atmosphere was suffocatingly formal, carrying the immense gravity of a high tribunal. The tiered seating was not merely filled with peers and faculty. Occupying the elevated observation ring were the senior members of the academic board and, more intimidatingly, the grim, decorated representatives of the Frontier Colonial Expansion Authority. This was no longer an academic vacuum. The blueprints presented today had a very real probability of being forged into steel and composite on the edge of known space. For the first 4 hours of the session, the hall was a theater of breathtaking technological miracles. The competing teams unveiled models that defied the hostile nature of the cosmos. One team projected a sprawling, self-healing city woven from smart matter, capable of repairing structural microfractures in real time. Another team showcased a defense and maintenance grid governed by a hive mind of suborbital drones, functioning with terrifying, synchronized perfection. A third group presented a nearly absolute efficiency energy core, suspended in a frictionless vacuum, while their residential sectors featured living architecture that autonomously adapted its density to match sudden shifts in atmospheric pressure. They were glorious, shining monuments to galactic supremacy. The colonial representatives nodded in deep, satisfied approval. This was how the advanced races conquered the dark. Then, Bren Holloway and his team stepped onto the central dais. When Orelk engaged their projection, there were no gasps of awe. There was only a profound, confused silence. Hovering above the projector was a model that looked like a patchwork beast stitched together from contradicting philosophies. It completely lacked the sleek, sweeping symmetry of the previous designs. Nemvox stepped forward to explain the decentralized, scattered resource reserves, deliberately placed in heavily armored, isolated bunkers, rather than a single, efficient hub. Thyray detailed the crude, biological guidelines and the low-tech acoustic emergency protocols. Keshmir outlined the redundant, localized medical stations and the mandatory cross-training of civilian personnel. Sailor Ven their plumage stiff with defiance, introduced the emergency-severing bulkheads, explaining the brutal mechanism that would physically amputate corrupted sectors from the rest of the colony. Finally, Orelk explained the deliberately fractured administrative power, a governance model that actively prevented any single leader or artificial intelligence from assuming total control during a crisis. The Grand Hall erupted. The presentation was immediately torn in half by a vicious, unyielding debate among the judges. On the left side of the tribunal, several veteran colonial commanders leaned forward, their eyes locked onto the aggressive redundancies. They recognized the scars of deep space. They argued fiercely that this was the most pragmatic, mature, and battle-ready design the Academy had ever produced. They saw a fortress that refused to die. However, the academic purists and the high counselors on the right side of the chamber were profoundly offended. An elder Cillian delegate stood up, his voice ringing with absolute disdain. He accused the team of presenting a regressive, bloated monstrosity. He condemned the design for its massive material cost, its lack of faith in technological progress, and its paranoid, fear-driven architecture. "You have built a tomb designed for cowards," the Cillian counselor sneered, the translation matrix delivering his contempt with crisp precision. "You have assumed that our greatest achievements will fail us. You treat highly evolved colonists like terrified animals scrambling in the mud. This is not the architecture of a proud civilization. It is a monument to pessimism." Sailor Ven bristled, preparing to unleash a torrent of calculated venom. Nemvox's mandibles clicked furiously in preparation for a tactical defense. But before any of the alien prodigies could speak, Bren stepped up to the edge of the dais. He did not raise his voice. He did not engage in the theatrical bombast of the counselors. He spoke with the quiet, tired certainty of someone who had seen the sky turn black and the water rise. "Our design does not rely on the assumption that everyone will always be right," Bren stated, his voice carrying clearly across the cavernous hall. "It relies on the certainty that people will sometimes be wrong, they will sometimes be terrified, and they will sometimes make mistakes. And they still deserve to live." The raw, unadorned truth of his statement struck the room like a physical blow. The debate died instantly. The Cillian counselor opened his mouth to retort, but found no counter-argument against the simple, undeniable math of human mercy. Professor Seraphine Quor glided to the center of the tribunal floor, her internal crystalline light radiating a deep, solemn gold. She looked at the patchwork beast hovering above Bren's team, then turned to the control console to initiate the final phase of the examination. "The philosophical debate is concluded," the professor chimed, her voice resonating through the hall. "We will now run the grand synthesis simulation. All projects will be subjected to the Omega-tier disaster matrix. The structural survival rates will determine the ultimate victor." She raised her hand to engage the master execution protocol. This was supposed to be the deciding moment, the sterile, controlled environment where theories lived or died in a flash of digital light. She never touched the console. A terrifying, low-frequency groan reverberated through the very marrow of the orbital academy. It was not a simulated sound. It was the physical vibration of millions of tons of hyper-dense orbital alloy straining against an unimaginable external force. Beyond the massive, panoramic observation windows lining the upper tier of the Great Hall, the pristine blackness of space violently warped. The steady, distant starlight was suddenly drowned out by a colossal, surging wave of chaotic, blinding violet and aggressive crimson radiation. A cascade of blaring, deafening emergency klaxons erupted across the entire academy. The pristine white lighting of the Great Hall snapped off, instantly replaced by the harsh, strobing red glare of emergency backup power. On the massive display boards, meant for grading, the simulation interfaces violently crashed. In their place, the Academy's own external sensor telemetry fed raw, unfiltered panic into the room. An unpredicted, rogue, supermagnetic storm, carrying a kinetic and electromagnetic force far beyond any localized weather model, was currently slamming directly into the helix array. The gyroscopic stabilization systems of the most advanced academic station in the galaxy shuddered, throwing several high counselors physically out of their seats. The floor tilted. Bren gripped the edge of the presentation podium to stay upright. He looked around the great hall. The pristine, civilized illusion was shattering in real time. The strobing red lights cast terrifying, disjointed shadows across the faces of the smartest beings in the universe, all of whom were suddenly frozen in primal, uncalculated terror. Then, the most chilling failure occurred. The crisp, perfect English translating the panicked shouts of the alien students suddenly stuttered in Bren's ear. It dissolved into a mess of digital static, then fractured into a cacophony of raw, incomprehensible clicks, trills, and harmonic screeching. The central quantum translation matrix was failing. Bren looked up at the digital escape route maps projected onto the heavy blast doors. The glowing green arrows, designed to automatically route the population to safety, were lagging. They froze, then flickered, then began pointing directly toward a sector that the external sensors showed was already buckling under the electromagnetic pressure. The highly evolved systems were dying. The perfect machines were lying to them. Bren Holloway released his grip on the podium and stood up straight in the strobing red darkness. He did not need a simulation anymore. As the digital maps failed and the translation static hissed in his ear, he understood the grim, terrifying reality of the moment. The academic exercise was over. The real test had just begun. The kinetic shockwave of the rogue, supermagnetic storm struck the helix array like a physical hammer. The impact instantly shattered the illusion of orbital supremacy. In the span of 3 seconds, the centralized navigational network collapsed in massive, cascading clusters. The environmental blast doors, receiving corrupted feedback from the hyperconductive dust tearing through the outer hull, began sealing at random, trapping panicked students in dead-end corridors. The public address system, completely overwhelmed by semantic mistranslation, began broadcasting evacuation orders in conflicting, terrifying loops. The highly evolved students of the Academy had never faced a multi-layered failure. They knew how to solve equations, but they did not know how to act when the equation actively lied to them. All the pristine systems the other teams had trusted so deeply became immediate, fatal liabilities. The central artificial intelligence, desperate to optimize a route that was constantly changing, locked itself into a processing loop and simply stopped issuing commands. The digital escape maps shifted from green to a fatal, incorrect blue, directing a massive crowd of terrified Cillian and Veltra students directly toward a promenade that was currently venting oxygen. The self-learning rescue drones, violently disconnected from their hive mind synchronization, dropped from the ceiling like dead metallic birds. Bren Holloway possessed absolutely zero official command authority. He was just a human exchange student. But right beside him, his team's operational demonstration model was already plugged into the Academy's localized mainframe. He did not ask for permission. He simply inhaled the acrid, electrically charged air and began shouting short, brutal commands. He bypassed the dead translation matrix, relying on the raw, universal urgency in his voice and sharp hand signals. He pointed at his teammates, assigning them the exact manual protocols the Council had just ridiculed as redundant trash. "Orelk," Bren shouted over the blaring klaxons. "Sever the primary grid. Use the micromesh to isolate the western sectors before the short circuit cooks the life support. Thyri." He pointed down the darkened hall. "Deploy the luminescent trails. The digital signs are leading them into a vacuum. Light the floor. Nem, drop the digital communications. Get on the acoustic rhythms. 1 long, 2 short. Keep them moving." The alien prodigies did not hesitate. The paralyzing shock that gripped the rest of the hall did not take them. because Bren had spent the last 2 weeks relentlessly forcing them to imagine this exact nightmare. The most shocking reversal came from Sailor Ven. The proud, cynical avianoid leaped onto the highest ruined presentation table. Their iridescent plumage flared in absolute dominance. Using a mechanical acoustic amplifier, Sailor projected a localized command that shattered the remaining academic protocol. "Abandon the standard operating procedures," Sailor screamed, their voice echoing above the chaos. "The central mind is dead. Follow the physical markers. Follow the human." Bren did not wait to watch the tribunal react. He grabbed a heavy canvas emergency kit and sprinted directly into the darkened residential blocks. The biometric locks on the dormitory wings were dead, trapping hundreds of students inside. Bren did not try to hack the keypads. He took a heavy kinetic spanner and manually shattered the hydraulic release valves, forcing the heavy doors open with his own shoulders. Inside, it was pitch black and filled with the screams of a dozen different species. The digital room numbers were dark. Bren cracked open a canister of industrial photoluminescent paint and splashed a thick, glowing green line low along the wall, entirely beneath the thickening layer of electrical smoke. He unspooled a thick nylon guide rope, anchoring it to a structural pillar. "Grab the rope!" Bren roared, grabbing a panicked Kezan student by the shoulders and physically placing their hands on the rough nylon. "Walk in pairs. Count heads. If the person next to you stops moving, you drag them. Do not let go of the line." He pulled them out in clusters, refusing to let them merge into a single, chaotic mob. It was not elegant. It was a terrifying, suffocating crawl. Students tripped over each other, coughing and weeping in the dark. But the crude, ugly tools worked. When a hallway collapsed, they did not wait for a drone to calculate a new route. They just painted a new line. When the noise became deafening, they followed Nemvox's heavy, rhythmic hammering echoing through the ventilation shafts. Keshmir stood at the junction intersections, a towering physical wall of muscle, physically catching injured students and dragging them into localized triage nodes that operated entirely on battery power and bandages. The things the entire academy had laughed at were now saving lives by the minute. Up on the observation deck, Professor Seraphine Quor stood perfectly still amid the flashing red lights. As a senior faculty member, she possessed a deep-level, hardwired override that could have stabilized the immediate sector. She did not touch it. She stood and watched Bren's team operate the station manually. She knew that every theoretical equation in the universe was completely meaningless if no one possessed the sheer, stubborn grit to execute it under the crushing pressure of reality. The chaos raged for 6 brutal hours. When the stellar storm finally passed and the Helix Array's secondary base power slowly flickered back online, the true scope of the event became clear. The station had survived. It did not survive because nothing broke. Nearly every primary system had suffered catastrophic failure. It survived because Bren's team had built enough crude, physical safety nets that one failure did not trigger an avalanche. Thousands of students and faculty members were sitting exhausted on the floors of the safe zones, kept alive by a chain of ugly, redundant, highly inefficient decisions. As the ambient lighting restored to a soft white, the surviving members of the High Council stood in the ruined Great Hall. They looked down at the physical guide ropes strung across their pristine marble floors, and the glowing paint smeared along their beautiful walls. They had to swallow the most painful realization of their long, celebrated careers. The crude project presented by Bren's team was no longer just the most controversial academic answer. It was the only emergency model in the galaxy that had actually proven its worth in a real, unsimulated disaster. Professor Quor glided down to the center floor, her crystalline structure chipped but glowing with an intense, triumphant light. She addressed the exhausted, battered remnants of the academy. She revealed the truth she had kept hidden for decades. She confessed that for 40 years, she had been searching for a single class capable of curing the profound disease of safe civilizations. It was a fatal sickness that convinced highly evolved beings that extreme optimization was synonymous with immortality. She looked directly at Bren, who was currently wrapping a simple fabric bandage around a deep cut on Sailor Ven's wing. It took a completely average human from a red-classified Deathworld to break their grand illusion. Bren Holloway stood in the middle of a hallway coated in electromagnetic dust and chemical foam. He was not a superhero. He possessed no mythic intellect or quantum processing power. He simply looked at the stunned, brilliant aliens surrounding him and finally understood what made his species so terrifying to the rest of the galaxy. On Earth, merely surviving long enough to grow up was a brutal, relentless education that the most advanced worlds in the universe had never even dared to imagine. Thank you all for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like this video, and support the channel even more by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.